Well, this has been a wonderful opportunity to talk about spiritual transformation in worship to an audience of mainly philosophers. And one of the things that I mainly focused on was first talking about some of the empirical studies that I've done related to this, but started out with a backdrop of some of the work in the area of the psychology of religion, and then more specifically with the focus on spirituality and health. So first, in thinking about worship, one of the starting points is really to define worship. What do we mean by worship? So we've had interesting conversations about that. From a Jewish perspective, avodah has been one way of understanding it, and that having to do with service. The definition that I like to start with is proskuneo. I may be butchering the Greek there, but proskuneo, which has to do with one meaning of that is to kiss. And then specifically, like a dog licking his master's face or hand. Now the group had particular interest in that because it was a different way of thinking about worship, but it does convey this idea of adoration. And what I like to highlight in that, a dog who's licking isn't concerned about how he or she looks. The adoration and the devotion is focused toward his or her master. And that, to me, is a very important part of worship, this sense of adoring, glorifying God, but also the importance of obedience and submitting to his will. And it affects not only what you do in a worship service, but all of life, essentially. So I then went on to talk about our first study, which was actually funded by John Templeton Foundation, a scientific study of worship, where we looked at what members of the congregation, we had a study of different ethnic groups, Korean Americans, Latinas and Latinas, and then African American and Caucasian folks from Presbyterian and Pentecostal congregations. And we were looking to see, expected to see a contrast denominationally, not as much of a contrast as you might expect, but we were asking about 4 different worship experiences. I'm going to highlight 3 of them particularly. When did people feel close to God? When did they experience struggle? And when did they experience transformation? We also had them connected to heart rate and skin conductance to measure that, physiological equipment that measured that. We did find some associations with increased heart rate as people describe struggle, a more conflictual time in comparison to close to God. But then I also talked and spent more time talking about the transformational experience. When did people, following a worship experience change that was behavioral? So we were asking beyond conversion, when did they actually respond differently to the people in their lives or in their community? Well, what's fascinating, we were also interested in the element, what in worship contributed to that change. What was most highlighted was, surprisingly, the sermon. Folks mentioned remembering something specifically from the sermon that resulted in them behaving differently in their lives. Forgiveness was a major dimension of this. They were either describing receiving divine forgiveness or being more committed to forgive others because of their own receipt of divine forgiveness. So this was a powerful understanding in terms of when people are describing in their own corporate experience of corporate worship, what contributes to a changed life. Well, they're often understanding something cognitively from the sermon, but also that has affective and relational implications. Now then, the next major study that I described was a study of worship leaders, where we were looking at interviewed, and I actually conducted these interviews of worship leaders, both in the States, but also internationally, varied experience, but worship leaders who were exemplars, who were known for engaging their congregation spiritually. Now, one of the fascinating things here, many of these, they tended to be more educated and trained either in areas related to music, because these are music worship leaders. What we found was that there were some that you could describe as being more performance oriented, and then some that were highlighted their God-centric engagement. Now, all of these worship leaders were committed, deeply committed to God, and reflected that deeply committed in their personal lives, and even talked about the role of spiritual disciplines and strengthening them. But what they described is almost like a tension. As artists, there can be a sense of when you're trying to prepare and be well prepared for worship, you want to be sure that you do the music well, if you will, even perfectly, so that you're maybe more focused on the performance. Even though the goal is to glorify God, there's a tension between making sure we have practiced well. So practicing well is important and an example of glorifying God. But what we also saw in addition to this was what we call the God-centric engagement. There were some of the worship leaders that were more focused on what we call this performance-centric dimension, but others were concerned about the quality of the performance, but also said, ultimately, even if we don't practice as much as we need, if I sense that God is saying we have practiced enough, even if the music isn't exactly what we needed to be, the Lord is saying, stop now, pray, stop in rehearsal, whatever God might be saying. They reported submitting more fully and regularly to God's will in that matter. Now, part of what that means is that even in the preparation for worship, there was a strong sense of submission and yielding to God. Then as these same worship leaders were talking about their worship leadership and even the services, you sensed, and I could sense this, even many of these interviews were videotapes or they were through technology, so the person wasn't directly in front of me. But I could sense interpersonally this sense of submission that this person was not only describing in their preparation, reflecting in how they would be worship leading, but I could also sense it in the relationship through this, through technology, that this is a person who is involved in an ongoing, active submission process to God. So a common phrase that the worship leaders used was 24/7, that preparing for worship that's going to be glorifying to God is not just what happens on a Sunday, is not just what happens in rehearsal, but is an ongoing 24/7 commitment to submitting to God. Now that was fascinating to hear that, and even to see this contrast, even with worship leaders who are exemplars. It was another lesson about worshiping God and really understanding what worship means to be in that kind of posture is a way in which we are submitting more and more our own wills, our own lives to God. Another thing that's important too, that we looked at embodiment. So it means that not only were these worship leaders talking about how they understood this in their preparation, but the ways in which they lived this out was almost reflected in their bodily postures. There's a way in which someone watching them, and even as I was watching them talk about worship, I got a sense, we call this kind of empathic embodied cognition, where you have a sense of somebody's experience, their emotional, their spiritual, their physical, in their body, you sense their connection and the depth of their commitment to God. So as I'm hearing them describing their worshiping of God and their worship of God, I myself found myself deepening in my own sense of appreciating God's presence in their lives, but also my life. So what does that mean? That would mean that part of what is transformational about worship experiences and life and certain worship leaders is it's not just that these worship leaders are leading the congregation in worship, they are actually worshiping and in an active submission process that the congregation witnesses and joins with and connects with. This is amazing to see, and I will be continuing to do work to understand this. Thank you.